The sound of a single gunshot tore through the silence of the empty warehouse. It did not echo once. It bounced off the corrugated metal walls, a sharp, metallic crack that refused to die. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. The impact was dull, final, and absolute. Dust motes danced in the stagnant air, disturbed by the sudden shift in pressure. Silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on the vast, hollow space. Outside, the Seoul winter wind clawed at the high, grime-streaked windows, but inside, the air remained still. A thin trail of smoke curled upward from the barrel of the weapon, dissipating into the shadows that clung to the rafters. The man on the floor did not move. He lay twisted, his chest no longer rising, his presence reduced to a cooling weight on the cold gray slab. The warehouse held its breath. Every corner, every rusted support beam, and every darkened aisle seemed to lean in, waiting for the next movement. Min-jun did not look away. He stood over the man, his gaze fixed on the cooling form with the same indifference he might show a discarded ledger. He checked his watch. The second hand swept past the 12 with rhythmic, mechanical precision. He had a schedule to keep, and the mess on the floor was merely an item checked off a list. He shifted his weight, the soles of his shoes grinding against a stray piece of gravel on the concrete. There was no pulse of adrenaline in his veins, no flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was a man built of silence and steel, and the violence he had just unleashed felt as natural to him as breathing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and wiped a single speck of dust from his cuff. He did not glance at the man's face again. The life that had been extinguished meant nothing more than a variable removed from an equation. He turned his back on the body, his movements fluid and controlled, and began to walk toward the center of the warehouse. The air remained frigid, but he did not shiver. Min-jun took 3 steps toward the exit, the rhythm of his stride steady and unbroken. He expected the vast, industrial space to be empty. He expected the silence to remain his only companion. But as he passed a stack of rusted shipping containers, the air shifted. It was a subtle change, a slight displacement of the stagnant dust. He stopped, his head tilted, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the gloom. He was not alone. From the deepest recess of the warehouse, where the moonlight failed to reach, a figure detached itself from the wall. As she stepped into the pale, blue-tinted light, the warehouse seemed to shrink around them. She stood near a support pillar. Min-jun's hand hovered near his side, his muscles tensing in an instinctive, predatory reflex. He had not accounted for her. She stood perfectly still, a silent observer in the heart of his violence. He stared at her, waiting for a scream or a plea. Min-jun waited for the inevitable. He waited for the trembling hands, the frantic retreat, or the sharp intake of breath that signaled a witness about to break. He was prepared to silence that reaction as easily as he had silenced the man on the floor. But the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She did not recoil. She did not look for an exit. Instead, she locked her eyes onto his with a terrifying, absolute stillness. It was a gaze that seemed to bypass his defenses, anchoring itself in the space between them. Min-jun felt the weight of her observation pressing against his chest, a physical pressure that made his own pulse stutter. He took a half step forward, testing the air, but she remained rooted, her posture unyielding. There was no fear in her expression, only a profound, heavy focus. He had built his life on the ability to make others disappear, yet here was a woman who refused to be unseen. The neon hum of the distant city seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their synchronized breathing in the vast, cold dark. She held his stare, turning the hunter into the observed. He felt the cold iron of his own resolve begin to waver. Min-jun broke the stalemate. He took a sharp, aggressive step forward, his leather shoes clicking against the concrete with a sound like a gunshot. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing against the corrugated metal walls. She did not flinch. Instead, she reached into the folds of her coat. Min-jun's hand twitched toward his side, his instinct screaming for a weapon, but she only pulled out a small, worn leather journal. The leather was cracked, the edges frayed from years of handling. She held it out, her fingers steady. the object bridging the distance between them. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave the mystery behind, but the sight of the book pulled at him. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against her palm as he took it. The leather felt warm, a stark contrast to the biting winter air. He looked down at the cover, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. When he looked up to demand an answer, she was already turning. He stood frozen, the journal heavy in his hand, watching the darkness swallow her silhouette. He was a man who held all the answers, yet, for the first time in his life, he held a question he could not solve. Weeks bled into the gray monotony of the Seoul winter. Min-jun found himself drawn to a narrow, dusty bookstore tucked away in a district he rarely frequented. He stood outside the glass for 3 nights, watching the yellow light spill onto the wet pavement. Inside, Amara moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. She climbed the rolling ladder to reach the highest shelves, her movements fluid and rhythmic. He pushed the door open, the bell chiming a sharp, unwelcome sound. He did not approach her. Instead, he retreated to the furthest aisle, pulling a random volume from the shelf to hide his face. From the shadows, he tracked her. He watched her hands brush over the spines of books, her head tilted as she organized the stacks. There was a profound stillness in her presence, a stark departure from the violence that defined his own existence. He felt the familiar weight of his own life, the cold, the silence, the steel, but here it felt alien. He was a man who lived by the clock, yet he spent hours simply watching her. He was no longer hunting, he was waiting. The air in the shop smelled of old paper and dust, and for the first time, he found himself breathing in rhythm with the quiet. The rhythm of the bookstore became his new anchor. Min-jun remained in the dim corner, his back pressed against the cold wood of the shelving unit. He watched Amara navigate the narrow aisles. She reached for a heavy encyclopedia, her fingers tracing the gold leaf lettering, before she slid it into place with a soft, satisfying thud. A stack of paperbacks slipped from a nearby display, scattering across the floor. He tensed, his muscles coiling as if expecting a gunshot or a scream. But she simply knelt. She gathered the books one by one, her movements unhurried, her face devoid of the sharp edges he saw in his own reflection. The contrast burned. His world was built on the sudden, violent termination of life. Yet here, she spent her hours preserving stories and knowledge. He looked at his own hands, steady and calloused, then back at her. She stood up, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and returned to her work. He realized then that he was a ghost haunting her peace, a man of steel trying to understand a woman made of light and patience. The rain began to lash against the bookstore windows, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out the city traffic. Min-jun watched the water streak the glass, distorting the neon lights of the street into long, bleeding lines of color. He could no longer remain a ghost in the corner. His patience had reached its limit. He pushed away from the shelving unit, his leather shoes making no sound on the worn floorboards as he moved toward the counter. The air between them grew tight, charged with the static of the storm outside. Amara was busy organizing a stack of journals, her back to him. He stopped 3 paces away. He saw the way her shoulders rose and fell with every breath. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet shop. She froze. She did not turn immediately, but her hands stopped their movement. He took one final step, closing the gap. He spoke, his voice low and steady. "Why were you there that night?" Amara turned. The flickering neon sign from the street outside cast a rhythmic, electric blue pulse across her face. She did not flinch at his proximity. She did not step back. Her eyes remained fixed on his, dark and unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the relentless drumming of rain against the glass. Min-jun waited, his jaw set. He watched the way the blue light washed over her features, highlighting the stillness in her expression. She looked past him, then back, her gaze lingering on the space where his shadow fell. "I was looking for someone who was lost," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of tremor or apology. She did not elaborate. She did not offer a name or a destination. She simply let the words settle between them like dust. Min-jun felt the weight of the statement. The answer was a riddle, but it was the first piece of truth he had ever pulled from her. The bookstore door clicked shut, leaving the rain behind. They walked toward the Han River, the city noise thinning into a dull, distant hum. Min-jun kept his pace measured, matching her stride as they reached the concrete path that hugged the water. The river was a dark obsidian ribbon, sliced by the long, shimmering reflections of bridge lights. He watched the water churn against the stone pylons, the movement hypnotic and relentless. Amara moved with a fluid, quiet grace, her gaze tracing the horizon where the skyline met the black sky. They walked for minutes without speaking, the only sound the rhythmic slap of the river against the bank and the distant, muffled roar of traffic. Min-jun glanced at her. She was watching the lights dance on the surface, her expression softened by the ambient glow. They were two figures moving through a vast, illuminated void, the city lights blurring into a soft, golden haze. Amara stopped near the water's edge, her hands resting on the cold metal railing of the bridge. She looked away from the neon glow of the city, her eyes narrowing as if focusing on something thousands of miles away. "It is not like this here," she said, her voice barely rising above the sound of the current. She described the red earth of her home, a soil so rich and deep it stained everything it touched. She spoke of the vast open skies that stretched until the world seemed to curve beneath them, a blue so intense it made the gray Seoul horizon feel like a cage. She moved her hand through the air, tracing the jagged silhouette of distant mountains. Min-jun stood a step behind her, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He listened to the cadence of her speech, the way she described the heat of the sun on dry grass and the smell of rain on parched ground. It was a world of color and scale he had never inhabited. He watched her profile, the way her expression shifted from distance to a quiet, aching clarity. The vivid, sun-drenched memories she pulled from the dark. Min-jun remained still, the cold air biting at his skin. Yet he felt a heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with the night. He had spent years building a life defined by precision and distance, a fortress of iron and silence. Now, listening to the cadence of her voice, those boundaries felt porous. He looked at his own hands, steady and calloused, and realized they felt heavy, as if the weight of his own history was shifting. A strange rhythmic pulse thrummed beneath his ribs, a sensation so foreign he instinctively pressed his palm against his sternum to quiet it. He tried to retreat into his usual detachment, to analyze her words as data, but the effort failed. The city lights, once symbols of his reach and influence, now looked like flickering, fragile things. He took a shallow breath, feeling the air expand in his lungs with an ease he had not known in years. His posture, usually rigid and defensive, slumped almost imperceptibly. He watched her, and for the first time, he did not see a target or a stranger, but a mirror to a life he had never allowed himself to imagine. The rhythm of their walk slowed as they reached the end of the promenade. Min-jun turned to face her, the city lights casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. He searched for a way to bridge the distance between them, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Tell me about your family," he asked. The question hung in the damp air. Amara stopped instantly. The ease that had defined her movements only moments ago vanished. She pulled her hands inward, tucking them against her sides, her shoulders rising in a defensive hunch. She looked away, her gaze fixing on a dark patch of water where the river churned against the concrete pilings. She did not speak. Min-jun stepped closer, his own curiosity overriding his habitual caution. He reached out, intending to gesture toward the skyline, but his movement caught her off guard. She flinched, her left arm jerking upward. In that brief, frantic motion, the sleeve of her coat slipped back. Min-jun saw it clearly. A thin, jagged line of white tissue traced a path across the inside of her wrist. She saw him looking and immediately pulled her sleeve down, her jaw tightening. She turned her back to him, the silence between them suddenly heavy. The air between them remained brittle, yet neither moved to leave. Min-jun watched the way she gripped her sleeve, her knuckles white, and he forced himself to unclench his own hands. He knew the protocol for extracting secrets, the precise pressure points to apply, but he let the impulse die. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the river. The water reflected the city in distorted, shimmering ribbons of neon. He took a step forward, keeping his distance, and waited. Amara did not flee. She adjusted her stance, her breathing evening out, and fell into step beside him. They walked without speaking, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the concrete, the only bridge between them. He felt the pull of her presence, a gravity that defied his logic. Every minute they spent in this shared silence felt like a transgression against the life he had built. He glanced at her profile, illuminated by the passing streetlights, and saw no judgment, only a steady, quiet endurance that mirrored his own. They were two ghosts haunting the same city, finding a precarious safety in the spaces where words were unnecessary. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, then pulled it back. The bond was forming. The river path gave way to the concrete arteries of the city. They merged into the evening rush, a sea of faces blurring into a single, indifferent motion. Thousands of people brushed past them, eyes fixed on screens or distant points, rendering everyone invisible. Min-jun felt the familiar pressure of the crowd, the way it usually demanded his constant vigilance. Tonight, it felt different. He watched Amara navigate the surge of commuters. She moved with a fluid, quiet grace, never colliding, never drawing attention. He stayed close, his own presence dampened by the sheer volume of the city. At the entrance to the subway, the current of people intensified. A group of commuters pushed between them, forcing Min-jun to reach out and catch her arm to keep her from being swept away. Her skin was warm beneath his grip. She didn't pull back. They stood for a heartbeat in the center of the chaos, anchored to one another while the world rushed by. They eventually slipped into a side alley, the roar of the subway fading into a low, distant hum. They stood in the shadows, two outsiders finding a rare, quiet sanctuary. Back in the sterile silence of his apartment, the journal sat on his desk like a live wire. Min-jun stared at the worn leather, the texture rough against his fingertips. He had spent his life dismantling secrets, yet this object felt different. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper or ink. He pulled his chair closer, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor. His hand hovered over the clasp. He flipped it open. The first page was filled with dense, hurried handwriting in a language he did not recognize. He scanned the lines, his eyes catching a date, the same day he had walked into that warehouse. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing through the empty room. His pulse spiked, a sharp, rhythmic thud against his ribs. He stood up and paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long across the walls. He knew he should burn it. Instead, he stopped at the window, looking out at the city lights, and felt the journal calling him back. The bookstore was a pocket of stillness in a city that never stopped screaming. Min-jun pushed the door open, the bell chiming with a soft, antique ring that felt out of place. He moved to the back, finding a narrow aisle between shelves of dust-covered histories. From here, he could see her. Amara was at the front counter, her hands moving with a rhythmic precision as she sorted a stack of incoming arrivals. Outside the glass, the Seoul traffic was a blur of aggressive motion and harsh light. Inside, she was a study in deliberate, quiet focus. A customer approached, impatient and loud, demanding a book that was clearly not in stock. Min-jun braced for a reaction, for the kind of sharp, defensive retort he would have used. Instead, Amara tilted her head, listened to the man's frustration, and offered a soft, steady response that drained the anger from the air. The customer left, quieted by her presence. Min-jun watched her return to her work, her fingers tracing the spines of the books with a grace that seemed to defy the chaos of the world beyond the window. He leaned against the shelf, his own posture softening. He simply stood in the shadows, captivated by the way she existed within the storm, untouched and entirely at peace. The bell chimed again, but this time, Min-jun stepped forward. Amara looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to a quiet, steady recognition. She locked the door behind her, the metal bolt sliding home with a finality that signaled the end of the day. They walked together into the night. The street was alive with the pulse of neon. casting long, vibrating streaks of pink and blue across the wet asphalt. Every few steps, the hum of the city seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their boots on the pavement. They stopped beneath a flickering sign, the light washing over them in rhythmic intervals. Min-jun watched her face, the way the colors played against her features, and felt the rigid logic of his life begin to fracture. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm, then pulling back. She did not move away. Instead, she turned to face him, the distance between them shrinking until the heat of her presence was undeniable. The rain began to fall, a fine mist that clung to the air, forcing them to huddle closer under a narrow shop awning. He looked into her eyes, seeing the reflection of the neon world, and for the first time, he did not want to look away. They found a small cafe tucked into an alleyway, far from the main thoroughfare. The air inside smelled of roasted beans and damp paper. Min-jun pulled out a chair for her, his movements precise, his focus entirely on the way she settled into the space. He watched her hands as she wrapped them around a warm mug. He wanted to ask about the warehouse, about the journal, about the shadow she had been living in since she arrived. He leaned forward, his voice barely a murmur. "You never talk about why you chose this city," he said. Amara looked at the steam rising from her cup. She traced the rim with her thumb, a slow, rhythmic motion. She began to speak of the red earth in her homeland, of the vast, open skies that stretched until they touched the horizon. She described the heat of the sun on the plains and the sound of wind through the tall grass. It was a vivid, beautiful picture, but it was a diversion. Min-jun listened, tracking the cadence of her words, noting how she carefully navigated around the timeline of her arrival in Korea. Every time he pushed toward the present, she retreated into the safety of her past. He realized then that she was not just a stranger, she was a puzzle. The cafe door clicked shut behind him, leaving Min-jun on the sidewalk. The cold air hit his face, but it did not clear his head. He walked toward the district where his office stood, a glass monolith that had once been the center of his world. Tonight, it looked like a tomb. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a signal from his associates, but he did not reach for it. He let the screen go dark. He found himself walking toward the bookstore again, his pace slowing as he neared the darkened storefront. He stood in the shadows, watching the reflection of the streetlights on the glass. The man who had built an empire on silence and steel was currently standing in the rain, waiting for a glimpse of a woman who occupied every corner of his thoughts. He realized with a sharp, sudden clarity that he was no longer the one in control. His pulse quickened at the sight of her silhouette moving inside. The rigid boundaries he had spent years constructing were dissolving, replaced by a singular, consuming need to be near her. The following week, the rhythm of his life became a series of quiet observations. Min-jun watched her from the back of the bookstore, his eyes tracing the way she handled the leather journal. It was worn, the edges frayed, yet she guarded it with an intensity. He began to track the small things, the way she always looked toward the street whenever a black car passed, the way she paused her work at the exact same hour every afternoon, staring at the clock as if waiting for a signal. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for the gaps he had previously ignored. She claimed to be a traveler, yet she knew the city's alleyways with the precision of a local. He stood by the window, his fingers drumming against the glass. The coincidence of their meeting in that warehouse began to weigh on him. He had dismissed it as fate, but his instinct started to scream. A cold, sharp realization settled in his gut. He decided then that he would no longer be a passive observer. The opportunity arrived when she stepped into the back room to organize a new shipment. Min-jun moved with the silence of a ghost, his hand closing over the journal left on the counter. The leather was cool and textured under his fingertips. He retreated to the dim corner of the shop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He flipped through the pages, notes in a language he did not recognize, sketches of city maps, dates circled in ink. It seemed mundane, a traveler's log, until his thumb caught on a slight unevenness in the back cover. He pressed the seam, feeling the resistance of hidden adhesive. With a sharp tug, the inner lining gave way. A single, glossy photograph slid out and landed on the wooden floor. He knelt, his breath hitching in his throat. He picked it up, The image was crisp, showing the man from the warehouse, but the face was different. There was no fear, no shadow of death. The man was laughing, his arm draped around a woman who looked exactly like Amara. The world tilted. The silence in the shop turned deafening. Min-jun held the photograph under the faint light of the bookstore lamp. The man in the picture was alive, his head tilted back in genuine laughter, eyes crinkled at the corners. It was a face Min-jun had never seen in the warehouse. That man had been a shadow, a target, a silent obstacle to be removed. This man was someone else entirely. He looked at the background of the shot, a sun-drenched street, vibrant and crowded, a world away from the cold concrete of Seoul. The man held a small child on his shoulders, his posture relaxed, his hands steady. Min-jun traced the jawline with his thumb, comparing the image to the memory of the man lying face down in the dark. The contrast was violent. He looked for the cruelty he had expected to find, the hardened edge of a criminal, but there was only warmth. The man was smiling at someone off camera, his expression unguarded and soft. It was the face of a brother, a protector, a person who existed outside the reach of the violence Min-jun dealt in. He turned the photo over, finding a date scribbled in faded ink. It was recent. The man had been living a life of light, a life that Min-jun had extinguished in a single, unthinking second. The weight of the image began to pull at his composure, turning the paper heavy in his grip. The realization did not come as a thought. It arrived as a physical blow to the gut. Min-jun stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the bookshelf with a dull thud. The photograph remained in his hand, the edges crinkling under his tightening grip. He looked at the woman in the picture, Amara, and then at the man. The resemblance was unmistakable. The curve of the brow, the specific set of the jaw, the way they both held their heads when they were at ease. He had not just killed a target, he had killed her brother. The air in the bookstore felt thin, suddenly impossible to breathe. He looked toward the back room where she had disappeared, his vision blurring at the edges. Every interaction he had shared with her over the past weeks took on a terrifying new meaning. He felt the blood drain from his face. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. The silence of the shop was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. He was not just a man who had ended a life. He was a man who had destroyed the only world she had left. The pieces began to lock into place with a sickening, mechanical precision. He looked down at the leather journal still clutched in his hand. He flipped through the pages he had previously ignored, his eyes scanning the dense, handwritten entries. They were not just notes on books or daily observations. They were logs, dates, times, locations, his locations. He saw the day he had left the warehouse, the day he had first visited the bookstore, the day they walked by the river. She had not stumbled upon him by accident in that warehouse. She had been waiting. She had been tracking his every move, mapping his habits, and calculating the distance between his world and her own. He felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up his spine. The woman who had shared his silence, who had walked beside him in the soft glow of the city lights, had been watching him through the lens of a predator. Every conversation they had shared was a calculated step in a long, patient game. He was not the hunter anymore. He was the prey. The air in the shop suddenly felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of his own rising pulse. Min-jun slammed the journal onto the counter. The sound cracked through the quiet like a gunshot. His hands, usually steady as stone, shook with a violent, unfamiliar tremor. He had let his guard down. He had allowed her into the locked rooms of his life, believing he was the one in control, only to find he had been a puppet on a string. Every smile she had offered now felt like a blade. Every soft word was a calculated strike against his defenses. He swept his arm across the table, sending a stack of hardcovers crashing to the floor. The noise did nothing to dampen the roar of indignation in his ears. He grabbed the edge of the display shelf, his knuckles turning white, his jaw locked so tight it ached. This was a violation of his very existence. He turned toward the door, the neon light outside casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He stepped out into the night, his pace sharp and lethal. The city blurred past him, a smear of rain-slicked asphalt and indifferent neon. Min-jun moved with a predatory efficiency, his stride eating up the distance between the bookstore and the cramped residential district. He ignored the biting wind. He ignored the pedestrians who swerved to avoid his path. His focus was a singular, burning point. He reached the entrance of her building, a decaying structure tucked behind a row of shuttered storefronts. A heavy iron gate blocked his way. He did not search for a key. He gripped the cold metal bars, planted his feet, and shoved. The lock groaned. The metal frame shrieked, and then the gate swung wide with a jarring clang. He climbed the narrow, concrete stairs, his boots rhythmically striking the steps like a countdown. The air in the stairwell was stale, smelling of damp walls and trapped heat. He reached the third floor and stopped. The hallway was silent. He stopped before the door marked 304. He did not knock. He stared at the wood, his hand hovering inches from the surface. The door gave way with a sharp crack, the lock failing under the force of his shoulder. Min-jun stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space until they locked onto her. He did not give her time to speak. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out the photograph he had found in the journal, and threw it onto the small wooden table between them. It skidded across the surface, coming to rest near her hand. The image of the man from the warehouse, younger and smiling, stared up at them both. Min-jun stepped forward, closing the distance until the heat of his anger was palpable. He pointed at the photo, his finger trembling with the effort of containment. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice a low, jagged blade. "Was any of it real, or was I just a target from the start?" He watched her, waiting for the defense, the denial, or the lie. He needed the truth to dismantle the foundation of the last few weeks. The room felt suddenly small, the air sucked out by the weight of his accusation. He leaned in, his shadow looming over the table, his eyes searching hers for the slightest flicker of deceit. He had come here to destroy the mystery, and he would not leave until the silence was broken. Amara did not look at the photograph. She did not look at him. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and fluid, and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of rain-washed color. She pressed her palms against the cool glass, staring into the dark street below. The silence in the room deepened, heavy and suffocating. Min-jun remained by the table, his gaze fixed on the back of her head, waiting for a tremor, a gasp, or a single word of defense. None came. He took a step toward her, his boots crunching on a stray piece of wood from the broken door frame, but she did not flinch. She stood motionless, a statue carved from the stillness of the night. Every second that passed without an answer acted like a hammer blow against his composure. He watched the way her shoulders remained rigid, the way she refused to acknowledge the evidence of her deception. The silence became a physical weight, pressing against his chest until he could no longer breathe. Min-jun's hand lashed out, sweeping a stack of books from the nearby shelf. They hit the floor with a hollow, jarring thud, but she did not turn. The sound of the impact seemed to snap the last thread of his restraint. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her shoulder and spinning her around to face him. His composure, the armor he had worn for years, finally splintered. "Look at me," he roared, the sound tearing through the cramped space. His voice was no longer the cold, calculated instrument of a man in control. It was raw, jagged, and desperate. He shook her, his grip tight, his eyes wide and burning with a frantic need for an answer. "I gave you everything, and you gave me a ghost." He slammed his free hand against the wall beside her head, the impact vibrating through the floorboards. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He leaned into her space, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Tell me it was a lie. Tell me you never cared, so I can finally stop feeling this." Amara did not pull away. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, meeting his fury with a calm that felt like ice against his fire. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and when she spoke, her voice was low, devoid of the tremor that shook his own. "You see a target," she said, her words cutting through the lingering echoes of his shout. "You see a name on a list, a ghost to be erased." She gestured toward the photograph still clutched in his hand. He was not a threat. He was the only thing that kept the world from crushing me. She moved past him, her footsteps light on the worn floorboards, and stopped by the small, flickering lamp. The light cast long, shifting shadows across the room. She began to speak of the places she had been, the hunger, the cold, and the relentless pursuit of those who wanted her gone. Every word was a stone dropped into a deep well. She explained how he had shielded her from the cruelty of strangers and the indifference of the law. The man he had dismissed as a simple obstacle was revealed as the foundation of her entire existence. The silence that returned was a heavy, undeniable truth. She turned back to him, her posture rigid, the weight of her confession hanging in the stagnant air. "I did not come here to hunt you," she said, her voice steadying as she laid out the timeline of her arrival. She had tracked her brother across continents, not to exact a price for his blood, but to pull him out of the shadows before the city claimed him. She had spent every cent she possessed to reach Seoul, navigating the bureaucracy and the cold streets, with one singular objective: to find him and force him to leave. She described the nights spent waiting outside the warehouse, the desperate messages she had left in the journal, and the plan she had devised to smuggle him out of the country. Her goal was never to confront the man who stood before her now. It was to bypass him entirely. She had seen the danger closing in, the way the city had begun to tighten its grip on her brother, and she had moved with everything she had to intercept him. When she spoke of the night in the warehouse, she did not speak of murder or revenge. She spoke of a failed rescue, a final attempt to reach him, before the trigger was pulled. The realization hit Min-jun with the force of a physical blow. He had been the wall she was trying to climb over. The air in the room seemed to thin as the final piece of the puzzle locked into place. Min-jun looked at her, seeing not a stranger, but a woman who had walked through the wreckage he created. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and the distance between them felt like a chasm. She confessed that she had known who he was long before they met in the bookstore. She had studied his movements, his habits, and the cold efficiency of his work, expecting to find a monster. Instead, she had found a man who shared her isolation. The irony was a jagged blade. She had come to Seoul to save the only person who mattered, yet she had spent her nights walking the riverbanks with the very man who had ended that life. She spoke of the nights she spent fighting the urge to turn away, the way her resentment had slowly bled into a different, more terrifying feeling. She had fallen for the architect of her own ruin. She had sought comfort in the hands that had pulled the trigger. The admission hung in the room, raw and absolute. It was a betrayal of her own blood, a surrender to the enemy that left her hollow. Min-jun watched her, the silence between them no longer a void, but a mirror reflecting the devastation they had both caused. There was no path back, and no way forward that did not lead through the ashes of what they had become. Min-jun stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floorboards where she had stood. The silence of the apartment was absolute, pressing against his eardrums with the weight of a physical force. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had built an empire of steel and silence, and for the first time, they felt foreign. He had spent his life believing he was the architect of his own destiny, a man who moved pieces on a board with clinical precision. Now, he saw the board for what it was, a graveyard. Every success he had claimed, every territory he had secured, was cemented with the grief of people like her. He walked to the window, his movements stiff, and looked out at the city lights. They no longer looked like symbols of control. They looked like distant, cold stars indifferent to the wreckage he left in his wake. The power he had wielded was a hollow instrument, a tool of destruction that had consumed even his own capacity for connection. He turned back to the room, the walls feeling as though they were closing in. The realization was a slow, grinding ache in his chest. He had climbed to the top of a mountain of glass, and now he saw that his empire was not a monument, it was a tomb. He turned his focus toward her, really seeing her for the first time. She stood by the window, her shoulders tight, her breath coming in shallow, rhythmic hitches that betrayed the composure she tried to maintain. He watched the way her fingers gripped the edge of the sill until her knuckles turned white. It was not the posture of an enemy. but of someone carrying a burden that had long since become too heavy to bear. He moved closer, stopping just outside her personal space, and noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Every movement she made was a testament to the life he had dismantled. He had spent years viewing people as obstacles or assets, but here was the human sum of his choices. The coldness he had cultivated as a shield now felt like a prison. He looked at the space between them, realizing that the distance was not just physical, it was a chasm of his own making. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, a weariness that went deeper than any night without sleep. It was the weight of a world lost. He realized then that his power had never been strength. It was merely the capacity to break things that could never be repaired. He stood in the quiet, finally acknowledging that the cost of his life was the permanent, irreversible silence he had forced upon her. The internal divide tore at him. For years, he had operated with the mechanical certainty of a predator, never questioning the necessity of the strike. Now, the logic of his entire existence faltered. He paced the small room, his boots making no sound on the floor, his mind racing through the thousands of decisions. Was he capable of anything other than the systematic dismantling of lives? He stopped, pressing his palm hard against the wall until the plaster bit into his skin, searching for a sign of the man he used to be. That man was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void that demanded to be filled with something other than steel. He looked at the door, then back at the room, feeling the crushing weight of his own history. The instinct to retreat into the safety of his cold, calculated detachment fought against the sudden, violent desire to offer restitution. He realized that the power he had spent a lifetime accumulating was useless here. It could not buy back the time he had stolen or mend the fractures he had caused. He stood at the precipice of a choice: to remain the architect of his own isolation, or to risk everything on a single, uncharacteristic act of mercy. The struggle was not against her, but against the ghost of the man he had been. Amara moved. She did not strike, nor did she retreat. She simply took one step forward, closing the space between them until the air in the room felt thin. She looked up, and for the first time, he saw the full scope of what he had caused. It was not anger that burned in her gaze. It was a hollow, echoing exhaustion that made his own history of violence seem small and pathetic. Her eyes brimmed with a moisture that did not fall, a silent testament to a life stripped of its foundation. He tried to speak, to offer the cold logic that had served him for decades, but the words died in his throat. They were useless. They were insults. He watched the way her chest rose and fell, a jagged, uneven rhythm that mirrored the wreckage he had left behind. He had expected a confrontation, a demand for blood, but he received something far more devastating: a mirror. He felt his stature diminish, his shoulders slumping as the reality of her loss hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was no longer the predator. He was merely a man standing in the debris of another person's world, utterly humbled and stripped of his pride. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a standoff, but the sharp, clear atmosphere of a man who had finally found a target worth pursuing. Min-jun looked at his hands, the same hands that had orchestrated the downfall of countless rivals, and saw them not as weapons, but as tools. He had spent his life building a network of influence that operated in the shadows, a vast web of connections designed to erase evidence and silence dissent. Now, he would use it for a purpose that defied every rule he had ever lived by. He began to mentally map the path forward. He knew which officials were on his payroll, which files were buried in deep storage servers, and which men in the city would do anything to avoid his displeasure. He would have to burn his own bridges to build a path for her. It was a dangerous gamble, one that would likely end his reign and invite the very violence he had once commanded. He looked at Amara one last time, his resolve hardening into a singular, unyielding purpose. He would dismantle the case against her, scrub the records of her existence. He turned toward the door, his movements precise and efficient, leaving behind the man he had been to become the shield she never asked for. Min-jun sat in the dark of his study, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating the room. He worked with a surgeon's precision. First, he accessed the central police database, locating the digital footprint that linked Amara to the warehouse incident. He deleted the surveillance logs, overwrote the server logs, and purged the backup drives. A high-level security firewall triggered an alert, demanding an authorization code he had not used in years. He typed it in. He pushed the command through, watching as the files vanished into the void. Next, he moved to the legal registry. He forged a series of documents, backdating them. Every keystroke was a bridge burned. Every document filed was a piece of his own power sacrificed. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the records were clean. Her name was no longer a target. It was a ghost. He watched the final confirmation screen blink green. She was safe. She was free. And he had nothing left to hold on to. Min-jun stood on the opposite sidewalk, the morning air biting and sharp. He watched the bookstore entrance. Amara stepped out, her movements light, unburdened by the shadow of the law or the weight of his past. She checked her watch, looked toward the subway, and walked into the crowd. She was a stranger to the danger that had once hunted her. He felt the pull to follow, to ensure she reached her destination, but he stopped. He realized that his proximity was the only remaining vulnerability. As long as he existed in her orbit, the gravity of his life would eventually pull her back into the dark. He took a step back, melting into the flow of the morning commuters. He had built a wall of silence between them, not of stone, but of absence. He watched her disappear around the corner, a final, deliberate excision of his own desire. He turned his back on the bookstore and walked in the opposite direction. He would keep his distance, a silent guardian who had traded his place in her world for the guarantee of her future. The city swallowed him whole. The warehouse stood silent, a hollow shell of the empire he once commanded. Min-jun stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. He walked to the center of the floor, the exact spot where his life had diverged. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn leather journal. He set it down on the ground, the only evidence of a story that would never be told. He stood for a moment, listening to the wind whistle through the high, broken windows. There was no regret, only the heavy weight of a chapter closed. He turned away, leaving the journal behind as he walked toward the heavy steel doors. Outside, the Seoul streets were waking up, a river of movement and noise. He stepped into the crowd, his face unreadable, his past erased by his own hand. He moved with the rhythm of the city, just another shadow in the morning light. He did not check his phone. He did not look for familiar faces. He walked until the warehouse was just a distant point on the horizon. The power he once held had vanished, replaced by the quiet freedom of being unknown. He reached the train station, bought a ticket to a city he had never visited, and stepped onto the platform. The train arrived, the doors slid open, and he stepped inside. The train accelerated, pulling away from the platform with a rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Min-jun sat by the window, watching the gray sprawl of the city blur into streaks of concrete and steel. He caught his own reflection in the glass, a face he barely recognized, stripped of the hardness that had defined his years in the shadows. He leaned his head against the cool pane and closed his eyes. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for a decade began to dissipate, replaced by a hollow, quiet space. He thought of the bookstore, the rain against the glass, and the weight of the journal he had left behind. Those memories were no longer anchors, they were ghosts. The train rattled over the tracks, crossing the bridge that marked the edge of the district. He did not look back. He watched the landscape shift from industrial gray to the open, muted greens of the countryside. For the first time, the silence did not feel like a weapon. It felt like air. He opened his eyes and let his hands rest flat. The past was a locked door. The train slowed, the screech of metal on metal signaling the end of the line. Min-jun stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stepped onto the wooden platform, the air here smelling of damp earth and pine rather than exhaust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his watch, and left it on the seat. He did not need to know the time anymore. He walked past the station master, who did not look up from his ledger, and exited into the open air. The road stretched out before him, winding through fields that glowed in the late afternoon light. He began to walk, his pace steady. He passed a small stream, the water rushing over smooth stones, and stopped to wash his face. The cold water stung, grounding him. He stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and continued down the path. There were no targets here, no secrets to guard. He reached the crest of a hill, looked out over the vast, quiet valley, and took a deep breath. He took the first step into a life that was finally his own. The path narrowed as it wound deeper into the valley, flanked by tall grasses that swayed in the evening breeze. Min-jun walked without urgency, his focus shifting from the horizon to the immediate details of the earth beneath his feet. He noticed the texture of the soil, the way the light caught the edges of the leaves, and the distant, rhythmic call of birds settling for the night. He reached a small stone bridge crossing a shallow creek and paused, leaning his weight against the weathered railing. The water moved with a gentle, persistent force, carving its own way through the landscape. He watched the current for a long time. He pushed away from the bridge and continued forward, his shadow stretching long and thin across the path. The sun dipped below the tree line. He found a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of the woods, its structure solid and quiet. He stepped inside, the air cool and still. He sat on the floor, listening to the silence. He was no longer a man defined by his past. He was simply a man, finally at rest. The interior of the cabin held the scent of dry wood and undisturbed dust. Min-jun remained seated, his back against the rough-hewn wall, watching the last sliver of daylight retreat from the floorboards. Outside, the crickets began their rhythmic chorus, a steady pulse that replaced the chaotic noise of the city he had left behind. He thought of the journal, the ink on the pages, and the weight of the secrets he had carried for so long. They felt like relics from a different lifetime, belonging to a man who no longer existed. He reached out, tracing the grain of the wood beneath his palm, feeling the reality of the present moment. There was no need to plan, no need to calculate, and no need to look over his shoulder. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the forest fill the space where his ambition used to be. The transition was complete. He had traded the cold steel of his past for the warmth of the earth and the vast, unscripted quiet of the night. He breathed in, slow and deep, and let the air out in a long, steady exhale. The story ended here. The night deepened, then slowly surrendered to the gray light of pre-dawn. Inside the cabin, the air grew crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine and wet earth. Min-jun opened his eyes. He did not move immediately, instead letting his gaze wander across the rafters where shadows still clung to the wood. The silence was absolute, no longer heavy with the weight of decisions or the echo of past actions. He stood up, his joints stiff from the cold floor, and moved toward the door. He pushed it open, stepping out onto the porch. The world was waking up. A thin mist hung over the trees, softening the edges of the landscape. He walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and reached the edge of the clearing. He stopped, looking out toward the horizon, where the first hint of gold pierced the clouds. He took a deep breath. The forest path narrowed, winding deep into the dense green canopy. Min-jun moved with a quiet, measured pace, his presence becoming one with the rustling leaves and the shifting light. Every step took him further from the life he had constructed, dissolving the boundaries of his former identity. He reached a stream, the water clear and cold against the stones, and paused to watch the current pull debris downstream. It was a simple, natural motion, devoid of the complexity that once defined his existence. He crossed the water, his boots sinking into the soft, damp moss on the far bank. He did not stop to look behind him. The city, the warehouse, the journal, and the weight of his past were now just echoes in a vast, indifferent landscape. He walked until the trees grew thick. If you love powerful, real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.